Have you ever thrown away half a package of ground beef because it sat in your fridge for 4 days and started turning gray? Now imagine you just killed a 300-pound mule deer in late September, when the afternoon sun still bakes the canyon floors at 85 degrees, and you're 40 miles from the nearest dirt road with no ice, no cooler, and no backup plan. The average American throws away 250 pounds of food per year. Much of it meat that's spoiled because a refrigerator door was opened too many times, or a power flicker went unnoticed. But the frontier settlers of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, the homesteaders, the cavalry scouts, the cattle drovers, the wagon train cooks, they kept meat fresh for weeks without any refrigeration at all, using methods so simple and so effective that modern food scientists are only now catching up to what Grandma already knew. Stay tuned as we unpack the lost art of meat preservation that made the westward expansion possible, and why a cotton sack, a shady tree, and a hole in the ground could outperform a $1,000 stainless steel refrigerator. The first thing you have to understand is that before refrigeration, people didn't think about meat the way we do. We think of meat as something that comes in styrofoam trays wrapped in plastic, with a sell-by date stamped in black ink that we treat as a sacred deadline. The frontier settler thought of meat as a ticking clock. A fresh-killed beef steer or buffalo cow carried somewhere between 400 and 800 pounds of edible flesh. That flesh, at the moment of death, was sterile inside, but within minutes, the clock started running. Bacteria that live naturally on the animal's hide, in its mouth, and in its digestive tract begin migrating to the muscle tissue. The muscle's own enzymes start breaking down complex proteins into simpler compounds. At 90-degree summer temperatures, typical on the Kansas prairie or the Texas panhandle, the population of spoilage bacteria doubles every 20 to 30 minutes. In 6 hours, a single bacterium becomes 64. In 12 hours, over 4,000. In 24 hours, more than 16 million. The frontier cook didn't know the numbers, but she knew the smell. She knew the slime. She knew that if she didn't act in the first few hours after slaughter, the entire animal would be wasted. So what did she do? She reached for the 3 pillars of prehistoric food preservation that every culture on every continent discovered independently. Remove the heat, remove the water, remove the air. The genius of frontier meat preservation was that it combined all 3 principles in ways that required no electricity, no special equipment, and no chemical additives beyond salt and smoke. Let's start with the fastest method. The one that every homesteader within sight of a creek or river used as an emergency cooling system. Cold running water. A spring-fed stream in the Missouri River watershed runs between 45 and 55 degrees year-round, even in August. That's only slightly warmer than your refrigerator. But here's what the frontier settlers knew that most modern people don't. Moving water cools meat dramatically faster than still air, and it also cleans it. A freshly butchered quarter of beef lowered into a deep, fast-moving pool of creek water will drop from body temperature to within a few degrees of the water temperature in less than 90 minutes. The thermal conductivity of water is about 25 times greater than air. That means the creek is pulling heat out of that meat 25 times faster than hanging it in a shady barn. In those 90 minutes, while the meat is cooling, the flowing water is also physically washing away surface bacteria before they have a chance to penetrate into the muscle. A settler who butchered a steer at dawn could have all 4 quarters submerged in the creek by mid-morning, and by noon, the meat was cold enough to keep for days. But the real frontier secret was that you didn't have to take the meat out. You could leave it in the creek for weeks. There are accounts from Oregon Trail diarists of settlers submerging entire butchered hogs in willow baskets weighted with stones and left in the Platte River for up to 3 weeks. The meat stayed fresh because the temperature was right, the oxygen was limited, and the constant flow of fresh water prevented any localized buildup of bacterial waste products. The same technique was used by fur traders along the Columbia River, by Mormon settlers in Utah, by gold rush prospectors in California. Every stream was a potential refrigerator. The only catch was that you had to anchor the meat so it didn't float away, and you had to protect it from marauding bears and raccoons. A weighted basket, a submerged log, a deep pool with steep sides. These were the frontier equivalents of a locked refrigerator door. But what if you weren't camped next to a creek? What if you were crossing the dry plains of western Nebraska in July, with nothing but a wagon, a team of oxen, and 100 pounds of fresh antelope meat that was already starting to warm up? That's when the frontier cook reached for the second principle: evaporative cooling, powered by nothing more than wind and water. Here's the physics. When water evaporates, it absorbs heat, a lot of heat. It takes about 970 British thermal units to turn 1 pound of water into vapor at the same temperature. That's enough energy to cool 10 pounds of meat by nearly 100 degrees if you could transfer it perfectly. The frontier settlers couldn't do perfect energy transfer, but they could do something almost as good. They'd take a clean cotton flour sack, soak it in whatever water they had, even muddy water from a buffalo wallow would work, and wrap the meat in the wet cloth. Then they'd hang the wrapped meat in the shadiest spot they could find, preferably where a breeze would blow across it. The wind evaporated the water from the cloth, and the evaporation pulled heat directly out of the meat beneath. On a dry, 90-degree day on the high plains, where relative humidity might be only 20 or 30%, evaporative cooling could drop the meat temperature into the 50s. That's not refrigerator cold, but it's cold enough to slow bacterial growth from explosive to manageable. The cloth would dry out in a few hours, but you could re-wet it. You could keep that meat cool indefinitely as long as you had water and a breeze. The frontiersmen who drove cattle up the Chisholm Trail used a version of this every single day. After a long morning of pushing longhorns through the heat, they'd butcher a calf that had gone lame or been injured in a stampede. They'd wrap the fresh meat in wet canvas tarps and hang the tarps under the chuck wagon, where the moving shadows and the breeze from the wagon's motion kept the evaporation going. The cook, riding on the wagon seat, would pour water from the barrel over the tarps every hour or so. That meat might travel 200 miles before it was eaten, and travelers' accounts say it was as fresh on day 5 as it was on day 1. But evaporative cooling was a short-term solution. For long-term storage, the frontier settlers turned to something far more effective: the earth itself. The ground, once you dig down about 3 or 4 feet, maintains a remarkably constant temperature year-round. In the Great Plains, that constant temperature is between 50 and 55 degrees. In the northern Rockies, it's closer to 45. In the desert Southwest, it might be 65 or 70, still cooler than the air on a summer day. A hole in the ground is a passive refrigerator that never breaks down, never needs defrosting, and never runs up your electric bill. The homesteader's root cellar was the most common expression of this principle. Every farmhouse worth its salt had a root cellar dug into a north-facing hillside with thick wooden shelves for storing potatoes, carrots, cabbages, apples, and, yes, meat. A good root cellar stayed between 35 and 45 degrees all winter and between 45 and 55 degrees all summer. That's perfect for hanging fresh beef or pork. A quarter of beef, hung from a hook in the ceiling of a root cellar, could stay fresh for 3 to 5 weeks in the fall and even longer in the winter. The cool temperature slowed bacterial growth to a crawl. The slight airflow through the cellar's ventilation shafts kept the surface of the meat dry, which further inhibited spoilage. and the darkness prevented the chemical reactions that cause meat to discolor and develop off flavors. But the true frontier masters of earth cooling were the buffalo hunters of the southern plains. These men, working for commercial hide companies in the 1870s and 1880s, killed buffalo by the thousands. They couldn't possibly eat all that meat, and they weren't saving the meat for themselves anyway. They were after the hides. But they still needed to feed themselves and their skinners, and they needed fresh meat that would last through weeks of hunting. Their solution was the buffalo cooler, a technique borrowed from the Comanche and Kiowa hunters who had been doing it for centuries. They'd dig a pit about 4 feet deep and 6 feet across, line it with green buffalo hides, and fill it with meat. Then they'd cover the pit with more hides, weigh down the edges with rocks, and pile 2 feet of dirt on top. The ground temperature kept the meat cool. The hides prevented contamination and kept out insects. The dirt insulated against the surface heat. A buffalo cooler opened 2 weeks later would yield meat that was still red, still firm, and still perfectly edible. Some accounts claim meat kept this way stayed good for over a month in the heat of August. The problem with all these methods, creeks, evaporative cloths, root cellars, earth pits, was that they only slowed spoilage. They didn't stop it forever. Eventually, the bacteria would win. To really make meat last for months or even years, the frontier settlers had to go beyond cooling. They had to fundamentally change the nature of the meat itself. They had to remove the water. Drying meat is the oldest food preservation technique in human history. It's also the most reliable. The principle is brutally simple. Bacteria need water to live and reproduce. If you take the water away, the bacteria die or go dormant, and the meat becomes stable at room temperature. The frontier settlers dried meat by the ton. They'd slice fresh beef or buffalo into thin strips, about 1/4 inch thick, 6 inches long, and 2 inches wide, and hang those strips on wooden racks in the sun. On the high plains with low humidity, strong sun, and constant wind, those strips would dry to leathery hardness in 2 to 3 days. That's jerky. Good jerky has a water content below 15%. At that level, no bacteria can grow. Mold might try to get a foothold if the jerky is stored in a damp place, but in a dry canvas bag hung inside a teepee or a sod house, jerky would last for a year or more. But jerky had its limits. It was tough. It required a lot of chewing. And it lacked the caloric density that a hard-working frontiersman needed to survive a winter blizzard or a day of digging post holes. That's where pemmican came in. Pemmican was the superfood of the frontier, the original energy bar, and it was so nutritionally complete that a man could live on nothing else for months at a time. Pemmican started with dried meat. Buffalo was preferred, but beef, elk, deer, or antelope would work. The dried meat was pounded into a coarse powder using a stone hammer and a hide bag. While someone was pounding the meat, someone else was rendering fat. Buffalo fat was best. It had a higher melting point than beef fat and was less likely to go rancid, but any clean animal fat would do. The rendered fat was heated until it was liquid but not smoking, then poured over the powdered meat in a ratio of roughly 1 part fat to 1 part meat by weight. The mixture was stirred until every particle of meat was coated in hot fat. Then it was packed into rawhide bags, sewn shut, and allowed to cool. As the fat cooled, it solidified into a dense, brick-like loaf that could be sliced with a knife or an axe. What made pemmican so extraordinary was the fat. Fat is the most energy-dense food there is, at about 9 calories per gram, compared to 4 calories per gram for protein or carbohydrates. A pound of pemmican contained somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 calories, depending on how much fat was used. A frontiersman doing heavy physical labor needed about 4,000 calories per day in winter. 2 pounds of pemmican would get him there. But the fat did more than just provide calories. It sealed the dried meat powder away from oxygen. Oxygen is what causes fats to go rancid and what allows any surviving bacteria or mold spores to reactivate. By encasing the dried meat in solid fat, the pemmican maker created an oxygen-free environment that was almost perfectly stable. Properly made pemmican, stored in a cool, dry place, would last for years. There are documented cases of pemmican being eaten 10 years after it was made, still perfectly good. The Hudson's Bay Company, which bought pemmican by the ton from indigenous producers, considered it shelf-stable indefinitely. The frontier settlers didn't just eat pemmican as a survival ration, they cooked with it. A chunk of pemmican dropped into a pot of boiling water melted into a rich, savory broth studded with tender bits of rehydrated meat. That was the original instant soup, ready in minutes, needing no additional ingredients. Pemmican could be fried in its own fat to make something like a hamburger. It could be sliced thin and eaten cold on the trail. It could be crumbled into cornmeal mush to add protein and flavor. There was nothing else like it in the 19th century food landscape, and it was entirely dependent on no technology more advanced than a stone hammer and a hide bag. The frontier had one more preservation trick up its sleeve, one that combined cooling, drying, and chemical preservation all at once: smoke. A smokehouse was a standard feature on every homestead that had enough trees to provide fuel. The principle of smoking was twofold. The heat from the fire helped dry the meat, and the smoke itself deposited antimicrobial compounds on the meat's surface. Hardwoods like hickory, oak, and mesquite produced smoke rich in phenols, formaldehyde, and acetic acid, all of which kill bacteria and inhibit mold. A ham or a side of bacon hung in a smokehouse for 2 weeks of low, cool smoking. Never hot enough to cook the meat, just warm enough to dry it slowly, could then be hung in the root cellar and eaten for the next 6 to 12 months. The frontier settlers didn't know the chemistry. They didn't know what phenols were or how formaldehyde worked. But they knew that smoke made meat last longer. They knew that salt helped even more. Salting, or corning as it was called when the salt was mixed with saltpeter and sugar, was another ancient technique that frontier cooks used constantly. A salt brine of about 15 to 20% concentration, that's roughly 1 cup of salt per gallon of water, is too salty for bacteria to survive. Meat submerged in that brine would cure rather than spoil. The salt penetrated the meat over the course of several weeks, drawing water out and pulling salt in. The result was corned beef, or salt pork, so salty that it would make your lips pucker if you tasted it raw, but after a long soak in fresh water to remove the excess salt, perfectly edible and surprisingly good. The combination of salting and smoking was even more powerful. A salt-cured ham that was then cold-smoked for a week could be hung in a pantry and eaten 2 years later. Frontier diaries are full of references to hams that were smoked one winter and eaten the next, with no noticeable loss of quality. The salt and smoke worked together, each covering the weaknesses of the other. Salt didn't penetrate all the way to the bone in a thick ham, but smoke did. Smoke didn't kill salt-tolerant bacteria, but salt did. Together, they created a preservation system that was nearly invincible. What's striking about all these methods, looking back from our modern perspective, is how low-tech they were. No freezers, no refrigerators, no vacuum sealers, no chemical preservatives beyond salt and smoke. And yet, the frontier settlers wasted almost no meat. When they killed an animal, they used every pound. The fresh meat was eaten immediately or cooled in the creek. The less tender cuts were dried into jerky or ground and mixed with fat into pemmican. The hams and shoulders were salted and smoked. The fat was rendered into tallow for cooking and soap making. The bones were boiled for broth. The hide was tanned for leather. The frontier didn't have a food waste problem because the frontier couldn't afford one. Every scrap of food had to be preserved somehow, or the winter might bring starvation. The comparison to our own time is almost embarrassing. The average American household throws away about 40% of the food it buys. Meat is one of the most commonly wasted items, partly because we treat refrigerator storage as a passive activity. We put it in the fridge and assume it will be fine. And partly because we've lost the skills and the mindset that would allow us to preserve meat without refrigeration. The frontier cook knew that a wet cloth and a breeze could keep meat cool. The modern suburbanite buys an extra freezer and fills it with food that will be forgotten and eventually thrown out. The frontier cook knew that a hole in the ground was a refrigerator. The modern homeowner throws away a refrigerator because the compressor failed and a replacement costs more than a new unit. This isn't nostalgia. It's not a call to abandon modern refrigeration and go back to digging root cellars. But it is a reminder that the principles of food preservation are universal. They don't change just because we have electricity. Cold is cold, whether it comes from a compressor or a creek. Dry is dry, whether it comes from a dehydrator or the afternoon sun. And fat is fat, whether it comes from a grocery store or a freshly killed buffalo. The frontier secret to keeping meat fresh for weeks was not a secret at all. It was a set of skills, learned from indigenous peoples and passed down through generations, that turned the landscape itself into a preservation system. A creek was a refrigerator. A windy ridge was a dehydrator. A shady hillside was a root cellar. A smokehouse was a chemical factory that ran on nothing but wood and fire. The frontier settlers didn't invent these methods. They inherited them, adapted them, and relied on them. And when the winter wind howled and the snow piled high against the sod house door, they opened the pantry, took down a ham that had been smoked the previous spring, and gave thanks for the simple, brilliant physics that kept them alive. Drop a comment below. What's the longest you've ever kept meat fresh without a refrigerator? Have you ever made pemmican or jerky? Or do you have a root cellar story from your grandparents? Where are you watching from, and what old-school preservation method do you think deserves a comeback? Hit that subscribe button for one frontier skill every week, and hit the like button if this video made you think twice before throwing away that package of ground beef. Because sometimes the old ways aren't obsolete. They're just waiting for